Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our media team. My name is Amina Barnes-Cannon, and I'm with AOI. Today's faculty-led workshop is the Ubiquitous Research Paper, a two-part series, Research Writing Roundtable Part 1 by Lisa Johnson-Shull. Lisa is the Associate Director of the Writing Program. She's been at WSU for 30 years, and her specialty is in teaching teachers to teach writing.
Thank you. So the come from that I have that I wanted to start with in terms of context and stage setting is somebody who's really worked in and next to the Writing Center for really that entire 30 years. And I've learned an incredible amount about teaching writing from the experiences of students who are coming to the Writing Center and who are struggling with what they've been asked to do. And the reason that I titled this particular workshop the Ubiquitous Research Paper, ubiquitous meaning everywhere at all times, is because almost every paper that that students bring into the Writing Center is called a research paper, and every paper has a different definition for what that actually means, which ends up being incredibly confusing to students. And so what this presentation conversation intends to do is to sort of unpack what the different dimensions of research are, both in terms of process to do it and the process and product to write about it. So for those of you who are kind of the audience here presently, you could even look at these handouts if you're interested in them, because they're a little bit different than what's actually on the slides. Amina, you want one? All right. So let's go ahead and go to slide one. I'm going to kind of forego the workshop-y piece of it because it's not as relevant right this minute. All right, so in terms of the way that we look at research, we've got three different process types, and I've indicated them using these particular symbols. We've got an inductive research process, which is the upside down red triangle. We have the research report, which is the yellow rectangle, and the deductive argumentative essay process, which is the right side up blue triangle. Depending on the area of the university that you work in, you will be introduced to or invited to do these different kinds of things, and yet they are often just all referred to as research. So the inductive research process, which is the first one there, and Amina, I think you can go to that next slide. No, I guess the next slide is on here. It's not really up there. It's on the handout. So inductive research is what's commonly conducted by scientists, and what inductive research really starts with is a question. So if you're asked to do research in the sciences, what you're really asked to do is come up with a research question and then to do a certain process to ultimately answer that question, and that we often call that a hypothesis. If you're in the humanities, you're more likely going to be doing deductive or persuasive research, which starts with a thesis, which is really an answer to the question rather than the question itself, and really assumes that you've actually already done the research, right? Because technically, and you'll see this as we get to some of these other slides, you can't answer the question until you've done the research. And yet, in a lot of research papers that start with this thesis defense, assume that you've already done the research, when in fact that may not be the best assumption. So inductive research is usually question-based. It uses data and ideas as evidence to answer that question. It analyzes and interprets data and ideas. It reaches a result, and ultimately it creates new knowledge. And that's the red one. The yellow one is a research report, right? And all that does is it informs. It's topic-based, it gathers and summarizes data and ideas, it presents analysis, maybe an interpretation of others. It also requires research, right, to gather the information. And then the last one, this deductive, the blue triangle. It's to inform and to convince. It takes a stance, which is the form of the thesis. It has an audience in mind. It uses logic as a primary but not the only rhetorical appeal, and includes unique perspective and the conclusion of the arguer, and it applies known knowledge to reach a conclusion. So these are three really different processes that all fall under the ubiquitous category of the research paper. And so you could see how it might possibly be confusing to students if they don't exactly know which one that they're supposed to do. So I think we can go to the next slide here, which was the danger. Do not try this at home or in your classroom. And I'm going to set up some less than stellar examples. I think it's really good for academics to learn from less than stellar examples, partly because we love to take things apart, and we're good at taking things apart. A lot harder to put things back together. So a caveat about taking apart these particular assignments that are going to come up here is that it's really easy for us to do that, but it's not as easy, I understand, for faculty to create assignments. So the next slide should be that the first bad example. Is that true, or is it on the handout? It's on the handout. Okay, so the first bad example is, and a lot of these examples come to me as things that students bring to the Writing Center. Some of them have been gleaned from standardized tests, like for the state standards for the Common Core, which I think is really horrifying. So we're going to look at that. But the first one was called a Women in Leadership assignment. It was a research assignment. And for the assignment, the student was asked to write a summary of a particular female political leader. So the student, or all the students in the class, had to pick a political leader who was a woman and write a summary. And the assignment was really clear that that's what they were supposed to do. And then so the summary would be the yellow rectangle, right? Just information. I just want information on this particular person. And then the direction says, while this is a summary of the individual, you are expected to follow the essay format, an introduction with a thesis, a body, and a conclusion. A summary doesn't have a thesis. A summary has a topic. It doesn't have a thesis. And so right off the bat, the student's like, okay, now I don't know what I'm supposed to do. The assignment asked for the student to use class sources to formulate that thesis, and then there's an example. So as you can see, all of a sudden, if we're trying to support this student writer into creating this particular paper, we've got to figure out how those two things can be compatible. And it's not that they're incompatible. One of the things on this handout shows you can combine all of these. It's just that we don't often think in terms of these symbols and combining these to create directions that allow students to see, okay, first I'll do the summary. And then from that summary, I'm going to need to draw a conclusion, right, about this particular person, and then I'll argue from a thesis. The second example is the one that's from a standardized research writing prompt from the state standards for the Common Core. And the assignment, I think this is an assignment given to like 7th and 8th graders, was to write a multi-genre research project on a person, event, movement, or topic of interest as it would relate to the American dream. And then there are steps that the writer's given to move through this particular process. And the very first step is about a pre-writing strategy, and then the direction, think, pair, share, which is a thing that they would do with their classmates, your findings to help consider your ideas, narrow your focus, and generate a research question. So the very first direction here about generating a research question invites the student to do inductive research, which is that upside down red triangle, which is what's my question, then I'm going to go out, I'm going to do some research, and then I might be able to answer that question. But the very next instruction in the exact same step says, next, draft a working thesis that answers your focus question and that can be used as a guiding factor to guide your research. So right off the bat, you have created an undoable task. You're supposed to generate a question, answer the question, and then do your research. And that is silly. First you generate a research question, then you do the research, then you would generate a thesis, and then you would argue the support of that. So this idea that this working thesis guides your research, no, the working hypothesis guides your research. That's sort of the whole point of this particular conversation. It's the point of the reason I think teachers need to be involved in this conversation and looking at the different methods and modes and processes of research so we don't give students undoable tasks, which really frustrate them. And then when they come for support, it frustrates the people who are trying to help them because the task is convoluted. And then you'll see in step 2, asks them to then go ahead and conduct research with 7 to 8 primary or secondary sources to explore all aspects of the thesis. The thesis already answers the question rather than asks the question. So again, reinforcing the fact that this particular process is a little bit upside down. Then there are additional instructions in this particular assignment that just continue to conflate, confuse, hurry, and overcomplicate what's already a complex process. So part of the goal of simplifying a conversation about research into these sort of symbols is to maybe help faculty break out and recognize when they overcomplicate something and then turn around and say, well, students are terrible writers, when in fact they're often just very confused about what they've been asked to do. So the next pieces on this handout, and I don't know if they're on the slide or not, I can't remember, would show how the multi-genre research paper, the assignment by the Common Core, could have been broken down into the particular process genre and actually work out. So for example, if it was an inductive research process that the students were actually being invited to do, they would be maybe instructed to start with an unanswered question on a topic that genuinely fascinates and engages you, gather data and ideas that illuminate that subject matter, your analysis and interpretation, and then lead you to synthesize a set of answers to your question, and then add to the body of knowledge in your field. So just asking them to ask a good question and go and research it. Sample questions would be like, how do you conceive of and experience the American dream? Is the American dream still alive in rural America? What's the millennial version of the American dream? And then students would go and see if they could answer that question. The next possibility would be to simply ask them to do a report, which is, go find out about the American dream, right? Your assignment is to write a multi-genre research paper following your sample report topics: the American dream through the eyes of members of, say, maybe Native Americans, the American dream through the eyes of Italian immigrants, the American dream through the eyes of our grandparents, or the American dream in rural America, in the West, the millennial version of the American dream. So it moves from a question to then just a topic. And then finally, if you're going to do deductive or an argumentative, the assignment would say, your assignment is to write a multi-genre research essay with a thesis statement involving the American dream, following our titles and thesis statements. So an example would be, not your standard American dream, or the American dream is dead in rural America. That might be a thesis statement, and then you would go and prove it. So anyway, there are a couple more handouts on here that tease out or separate out these really different requests. So for example, if the topic was American weddings, an inductive approach would be to ask, what are wedding traditions in America that may be everywhere in the world? And then you'd have to go out and research that. That same question, though, in a topic would be, here are just American wedding traditions. And then in the thesis, it's actually left blank because in order to answer a question about American weddings, you would have to do some research. So that's just reinforcing the sort of what would be the way to put that? The absolute import of withholding argumentative research requests until you've really given someone the time to actually do some research. And one of the things we see all the time in the Writing Center, particularly in the humanities, and I think it reinforces the Facebook argument conflict world that we kind of see right now, is students just pulling an opinion out of the air and just slapping it onto the page and then defending it with really inadequate amounts of research because they didn't research their way to that opinion. They already had it and they were asked to just deliver it and then defend it, which is a really backwards way to go about deciding how and why you think about things. This next example is in the sciences. An inductive research would be to ask like a question about poisonous frogs. How do they interact physically without harming each other? Or a report, which is that sort of yellow rectangle, would be about communication and social behaviors among poisonous frogs of the Amazon basin. And then a thesis relative to that topic, I don't know, right? Because I don't know anything about poisonous frogs. So it's not a rocket science concept, and I think the thing that's really important about these conversations with faculty is they're not rocket science concepts, but they're not utilized, and there is almost like a greased slide that goes on when faculty create writing assignments that causes them to conflate or to confuse these three really different processes and to create instructions that are confusing relative to that conflation. So one of the examples that I was going to have a group of people workshop is one that I came across the other day where the directions are, you're asked to write a research paper. Okay, so right about now we're in the ubiquitous research paper territory. That's a combination of claims of value and argument of definition. It's not going to be a social or cultural definition, it's a personal definition, and the paper is a claim of value because it relies on comparison and evaluation. So you're getting now some vocabulary about argument. So the student is being asked to make an argument of definition on what they personally define as funny. They're supposed to analyze situations where comedy is appropriate and when it's appropriate. Then there's some information about comedy and claims of values. And then the student's asked to answer some questions. What function does humor have for you? Do you think it's relaxing or educational? What are the purposes for it? And it says once you've figured out the purpose, it should be easy to think about the values of reinforcement. Choose 3 values that are fed by your definition of what's funny. We're still wondering at this point, what is the research that I'm going to be asked to do? You're supposed to back up your position with at least 3 sources. So we can sort of see here we've got that blue triangle going on. It's kind of a thesis if you're going to back up your position. 2 of those sources must be scholarly. One of the biggest objectives is to get them to think critically about sources. You're going to practice the ethos of the academy through the research, demonstrate the relationship between the rhetorical appeals. Answer these questions. What is the subjective definition of what is funny? What is considered bullying? And does humor cross the line to where it isn't funny? In addition to conducting research, one of the goals is to practice synthesis. Those are the instructions for a research paper. So, I would like to figure out ways to help faculty do this better, because I'm the one on the ground and not so much as the other consultants in the Writing Center who are trying to sort through what this means to help faculty or help students actually do it and do it successfully. And so the best thing that I could think of was to maybe come up with this sort of visual symbol system, and the combinations of things, like this particular symbol system then would indicate that first you want them to do a report, you know, to get information, then generate a question, then answer that question, and once that question is answered, argue a defense. And that really is, in totality, what we probably always want students who are writing research papers to do. But at least if you're not going to ask for all of those things, if you're going to ask for them in isolation, or if you're going to ask them in discrete pairs, you do it with some sort of logical understanding that you can't defend a point until you've actually done the other stuff first. And again, it sounds silly to even be saying this, but if it weren't for the fact that I see these assignments every day, then we would say, oh, Lisa, what are you talking about? That any child would understand that this is how this should go. So, given that a few of you in here are learning design consultants and sort of work with people who are creating curriculum or creating assignments and maybe doing some of this, what ideas do you have for how we can do a better job maybe looking at research like this or presenting research like this, and again, research process different than the research writing process, and talking about those things with faculty in a way that help them deliver instructions or create instructions that aren't so confusing.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
I won't speak for everybody, but kind of with an instructional design background, I always start with the objective and the whole purpose of the assignment. I was going to ask this question, but I think it's a dangerous opening. But one of the first questions that I ask is, should this be a research paper or should this be a paper? Because the first thing that comes to mind is, why are we doing this? And that's, when I say me, I mean student, instructor, everything. Like, why? Why am I doing this? Mm-hmm. And a lot of, like what you said, a lot of it is just because we're in college and you do research papers. That's what we do.
That's right. That's right.
So, and for me, not having any background in English, that's very hard for me because I don't know when the best time to do a research paper. And well, for me, I wouldn't do a research paper because I'm teaching math teachers. So I don't want them to do research. I just want them to do. But yeah, I mean, the simple answer is always starting with the objective and figuring out what success looks like. What would a perfect research paper look like? You know, what are the mistakes that you see commonly in these papers and how can we address those? Mm-hmm. It's probably not the best answer, but that's kind of all I have right now.
Why do you think this is so hard for people who design writing assignments to do? I mean, this is not like once a month or something, I'll run across an assignment that looks like this. It's every day. So why is it, and obviously we know why that is because the people that might need to be listening to this conversation don't show up to listen to the conversation, right? So that's one of them, right? I think people think they know how to teach writing just because they write. And they haven't stood back and they haven't broken it down into the pieces. There are discrete skills like basketball, you know. You have to know some discrete skills before you can actually put them together to play a game. But what do you guys, I mean, given that this is your job too, think that we need to do to sort of get faculty interested in doing a better job with assignment design. And I know, Christy, you're right? One of the things is answer the question, what are my goals, right? That can get complicated, though, because, so for example, with the WPA outcome statement, it's an outcome statement of writing program administrators that have decided as a collective that there are certain things that all students who pass first-year composition should know how to do, right? It's not an outcome statement, it's actually a goal statement. But some of the goals are demonstrate how rhetorical knowledge and awareness improve communication. Some of the goals are develop critical thinking and research skills, integrate personal ideas with the ideas of others, develop thesis and research writing skills, use reading and composing for inquiry, use information ethically, learn to find, summarize, analyze, and evaluate sources. Those are the goals. The particular teacher who wrote this assignment was writing this assignment to meet those goals, right? So there's another level, though, of backing up, I think, that has to happen, so that even though the teacher says, well, look, if you look in here, I'm asking for something from each one of those goals. I'm asking them to do research. I'm asking them to do synthesis. I'm asking them to find and summarize sources. But it doesn't, it's like a what's it called? Mulligatawny stew. Have you ever heard of that? Yeah, that probably saying it incorrectly. It's, but it's a stew where you just throw everything in your refrigerator that's about to go bad in it, right? And it probably tastes so. So anyway, that can function, I think, as a guide. But what happens when it doesn't? It just ends up making this sort of stew. Then where do we go from there? What about those of you who are students? Even though I know you're not in the role of student here, you're in the role of media person, but are any of you students who are media people? You are a student. Do you have any experience with stuff like this?
Well, see, I'm a STEM major, so I don't do a lot of writing papers. I try to avoid my schedule, so I don't have to do writing papers. That's the way I do my schedule a lot.
Okay. And I'm guessing that maybe that's true because you didn't have great experiences with writing things that were well received?
Yes.
Ah. Okay. Yeah. See? There you are. Case in point. We're not doing this very well. And I guess I really want to be on board with a group of people that want to try to do it better. So the only way that's going to happen is if they show up. And my experience, though, and just to be like really honest about this, because this has been my experience in doing writing across the curriculum work here, they will come if we pay them. And I've actually had really good luck with brown bags, faculty brown bags, that are a series of 10 meetings where these conversations evolve over time and then reinforce each other. And so just as an invitation to anybody who might watch this video or be part of this conversation right now that's not in this room, I would love to host those brown bags, and the writing program actually has a writing across the curriculum budget that allows for one or two of those cohorts to go on every semester. The cohorts are usually about 8 people large, and each person makes $35 an hour for coming to them as long as they come to 8 of the 10, which kind of ensures a cohort. The other option is to just say, you know, you get paid for attending, but then they drop in and out, and then they lose the coherence because a lot of this builds on itself. But given that, I've also had challenges finding cohorts that want to even be paid to participate, and maybe the idea of raising the hourly wage for that would be more enticing.
Lisa, do you know how we do norming sessions based upon critical thinking?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like there's some problems with norming here also. So, for example, if you had a prompt, and I've done norming before with critical thinking, or just with prompts, and found out that what they thought they were asking for was not what the rest of the faculty were grading.
Right.
Or was not what was being given, but they would grade it as if it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there seems to be some alignment issues here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So just in terms of language, for example, not just in terms of language, but also in terms of pedagogically, how do you learn things?
Right, right. Well, and I think that's the thing that gets really confusing, and it's what inhibits knowledge transfer for students who are moving, particularly in the first 2 years of their undergraduate curriculum through the UCORE courses. So they are taking science, they're taking social sciences, they're taking the humanities, and the vocabulary that's used in each one means something different, right? And that comes back to the whole point of this ubiquitous research paper, right? If you're asked to do a research paper in the sciences, you better believe your science teacher has that upside down red triangle in his head or in her head. That may not be that something they overtly articulate to you. They're just sort of expecting that you already know that that's how scientists do writing. But of course you wouldn't know that because in high school your scientist teacher didn't teach you writing, your English teacher did. And your English teacher teaches writing pretty much from the blue triangle. So you're exactly right. We have these very different epistemological sort of come-froms in these different dimensions, and all that means is different ways of knowing. Scientists know things inductively, right? Humanities people maybe more so deductively, but we all call it a research paper, and everybody has something different in their mind. And that has to come out, it has to be, and maybe there are more than those three symbols, the inductive, the report, and the deductive. I don't think there are, but I would be welcome. There are combinations of those. But how do we begin to standardize, which is the only word I can come up with right now, a certain vocabulary across the curriculum, right? Because that's really my job if I'm doing writing across the curriculum, so that faculty are more overtly aware of what their particular discipline does naturally or intuitively, and more overtly aware that their students probably don't already know that. And so I think scientists, and I had a wonderful cohort of people from Connors a couple of years ago, animal sciences, entomology, plant science, and they were the ones that were just hysterical about how often their students would do these thesis-based, those blue triangle essays. But what they didn't really empathize with is that's how those students learn to write research papers, because they learn to write research papers in history and English. So, but the problem is the student is always the one that gets ground up in these gears, and they end up just like he does, which is like, I'm not going to do it. No. And for somebody who loves writing, who thinks writing is probably one of the more liberating delivery systems that you can play with and create with, it really pisses me off that so many people are making students hate it because they're not stepping back and thinking about the assumptions that they're making, right? Back to the critical thinking, right? One of the components of critical thinking is questioning your assumptions. So how do we get faculty to come to the table to question those assumptions in a way that forces them in a way to be more clear about what their expectations are? I'm sure that's totally what you guys do all day long when you're working with faculty and designing courses.
You know, another thing I think you're pointing to that we encounter a lot is what we call expert blind spot.
Yes.
Right? So you know what you mean when you ask this, but you kind of just jump over the whole process of communicating that to the students.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's huge. And when it comes to teaching writing or assigning writing or evaluating writing, I don't know how that expert blind spot, I mean, I think it plays into the lack of being explicit about the particular process you're expecting. But I also think that a lot of people assume because they write that they're experts in teaching writing, and Amina, you would obviously know that's really not true. I mean, it is a discipline in and of itself. The teaching of writing is a specialty. And we have at this institution an M-course requirement, the writing in the major requirement, which is taught by faculty in the disciplines who know nothing really about teaching writing. And yet, in order for that requirement to actually matter, that needs to change. And I think what this particular sort of workshop situation is reinforcing to me is we've got to pay them. I mean, and I don't necessarily even feel badly about that, right? That they're busy and they need some kind of incentive to show up and think about a different specialty, actually develop a different specialty. And why wouldn't they maybe get some compensation for that?
Well, yeah, that's an incentive, but it seems like a natural incentive is just less confusion, less questions to answer, less students dropping out because they're tired of trying to figure out what you're asking for.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I tried to do early on in some of the brown bag advertising before using funds to pay faculty was to say, you know, half an hour with me and I can make your job so much easier. And I know that's what you guys do too, right? When you sit and you're like a writing center for faculty who are designing courses. Let me sit here and ask you some really pointed questions, and when you answer those questions, you'll be really clear about something that you weren't clear about. It's like therapy. And you usually pay for therapy, so you'd think that the idea of just getting the help, and I think with writing instruction, this is so true. One of the brown bags that I facilitated a few years ago, there was a professor there that told the group that she spent 8 hours once responding to a student paper. Just like, you know what? I guarantee you the student did not spend 8 hours learning from what you spent those 8 hours communicating. And I can guarantee you that that paper looked like probably, you know, an editor's hell with everything, that the student probably couldn't even sort out what the recommendations were. So a lot of what I can help faculty do is simplify, and so that no one would ever consider doing that again. Students, by and large, don't read faculty comments. We know that, right? So there's a lot that we know about students. And actually, Turnitin has done some of the best survey work, right? Because they have access to so many users. They've done some of the best survey work in terms of finding out how students access, use, or don't use teacher comments. And it's pretty scary when you look at when you're a writing teacher and you make laborious comments, to see what students say about how they receive student comments. And I, up until this semester, have taught fairly regularly the English 324, which is teaching teachers to teach writing in the high school. And even those students didn't read my comments. And so it's an important conversation, and I guess I wish more people were interested in having it.
You know, we give them critical thinking rubrics. We give students critical thinking rubrics. I'm thinking about the opportunity for the students to self-assess. So, for example, if the writing program's created rubrics for, this is what a research paper should look like. These are the things that maybe you should think about as you're doing that. This is what you should think about when you're doing inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning.
Yes, actually, that's brilliant, because the one thing that I hadn't considered, I told Amina and Christy earlier when we were over in the Spark that I would upload these particular documents to our M-Course website, you know, for faculty to use, or for the people at WSU Tri-Cities and WSU Vancouver to use. But I never really thought that these would be in more simplified form for students in the Writing Center. To look at the assignment and to say, okay, you're being asked to do this kind of paper or this kind of paper or a combination of these kind of papers. And, you know, one of the things we do in the Writing Center is we can't malign teachers in front of students. We do that, you know, when we go in the other room. And no, we really don't try to do that. We try to empathize with, like I said at the very beginning in this presentation, how hard it is to do this. It's really easy to rip it apart. It's very hard to put it together. But at least to help students understand which one of these symbols they've been asked to do and which one of these symbols that may be in the shadows that are prerequisite to them actually doing it well. And I think that's huge, because I think a lot of faculty do expect, and maybe not unreasonably, that if you're going to argue a thesis-based research paper, that you actually have done some research. And yet, I think if it's not scaffolded into the assignment, that is not always a fair assumption. But in the Writing Center, at least, we can say, all right, do you realize that with this, that bottom blue one, that there is the assumption that you've done the red one and the yellow one? And is that true? And they'll say, yeah, but it's due tomorrow. And so I'm making all sorts of generalizations that aren't really fair, but I just, there are patterns, and the biggest pattern is students really procrastinating this process, and in a lot of ways because they have learned to hate it. And that's really unfortunate, because writing should be like dancing or drawing or singing or reading. And amen. Any other questions, comments, concerns, challenges?
I mean, when I was going to college, kind of going into the learning experience as far as writing goes, coming out of high school, I despised writing. I felt that, the stuff that I was being asked to write about was, fairly not necessarily pointless, but it didn't really have a lot of value or effect to me. And a lot of the ways it felt that what my teachers were asking me to do was sort of like their own sort of like throwaway thing. Like, oh, well, I have to assign a homework assignment, so I'm going to do this, right? And it didn't really matter to me. I don't think I kind of learned, one, to write well, and two, to enjoy writing until I took a program at the school I went to that where both my faculty were so involved and engaged in the material themselves and the way that they presented us and taught us how to do our own research projects and how to do things like deductive and inductive reasoning. I think my favorite piece of writing I ever did was when I deconstructed Napoleon's invasion of Russia and, formed a counter argument to the fact that the Russians beat Napoleon and all these different type of things. And it was a paper that was, my teachers were like, this is, like the best piece of writing you've done all year long. And I feel like being able to kind of like get that middle point, where we can get your faculty to, one, enjoy the material they're giving out because they hope to enjoy the material they're receiving, and then also giving something to students that the students themselves are going to find enjoyable or interesting or useful to themselves.
Yes, and I think that teachers spend way less time in that under the iceberg piece of it, right? And way too much time on the part of the iceberg that pokes out of the water, because most writing teachers and English teachers will dread going home to read student papers, right? And they'll spill wine on them in the afternoons and then get them back, because that, and they'll complain about it, and it's really unfair in a lot of ways that English teachers and history teachers are the ones that are saddled with that. However, it's not also outside of reasonable to spend a lot more time helping students understand what they're interested in before slapping those assignments. That kind of peer review, we all know that peer review doesn't really work very well, and there are a lot of good reasons for that, but a lot of peer review or a lot of peer interaction could be around students sort of in expert groups or jigsaw groups or small groups, helping to define, what are some of the things that you're actually interested in that would in turn manifest some real research. Instead, we always go down the grease slide to gun control, marijuana, abortion, euthanasia, when in fact the real things people are interested in are like, I like boxer dogs, right? Cancer rates in boxers, and if you're going to get a boxer, how likely are you he's going to die of cancer, or what your vet bills are going to be. And real people have real interest in a more sane sort of environment of things that could actually be researched. But we don't spend a lot of time with our students to help them figure out what those are. I mean, students are interested in sports. Sports are full of data, full of stats, right? And, you know, my son loves history also, and, you know, I just don't know, that's another piece of it, is why are we actually falling short of that kind of energy generation? And I know that there's a lot of assumption that, and it's true, if you ask a student, you know, what are you interested in? Oh, I don't know. Well, what do you read? You know, what Facebook posts memes do you enjoy? What social media sites or newspaper articles do you go to? Or what television shows do you watch? I mean, there's a huge amount of questioning we could do to get at the fact that most individuals, by the time they're probably 12 or 13 years old, are actually developing experts in many areas, whether they're snowboarding or skiing or ice skating or soccer or violin or history or World of Warcraft or Dungeons and Dragons or basketball or football. And so, yeah, I would agree that we need a lot more time with that. And so, yeah, again, how to sort of get there from here. I think a lot of it is we just are reproducing old paradigms in education that we need to mix things up a little bit.
Thank you.
Okay. So, have we solved any problems today?
Oh, there's a part two.